Hey, so if you haven't already checked out last week's episode about finding your superpower, I think it'd be best to start with that episode and then come back and finish this one. Last week we talked about finding your superpowers, identifying the unique set of gifts and strengths that you bring wherever you go so that you can start to build a life that plays to those strengths because that just leads to a more fulfilling, fun, impactful life when you know your superpowers, know your strengths, and can start to play to those strengths. It was a fun episode. I think it was my best one yet. And just had that kind of good Mr. Rogers feel good. You are special, which is all stuff I completely 100% stand behind. But today we're going to look at the flip side of that and talk about our shortcomings. And in this episode, there's going to be a lot of talk about our superpowers working with and against our shortcomings. So I think it'd be great. Like I said, if you can start with last week's episode, come on back to this one. It's going to be fun. It can sound a little bit maybe negative. We're going to talk about your shortcomings. It's really not that at all. I hope it's an exciting episode because I think if we can do these two things, identify our superpowers and see our shortcomings, and then build a life as much as possible that plays to our superpowers and minimizes the negative effects of our shortcomings, man, that's going to be a good place to be. So that's what we're going to do today. Really glad you're here. Welcome to episode 8 of Me and the Quest. Well, hey, what's going on? Another episode of Me and the Quest. Welcome. My name is Ben Crosswaite. This is a show that exists to help you get to where you long to be in life, whether that's an external goal, an internal change you want to make. It turns out one of the best ways to make these sort of big, impactful changes in our lives is to live a little bit more like we're the lead character in a Disney movie. And I know it sounds silly, but I love filtering this deep wisdom from great minds and spiritual teachers and kind of filtering it through this easy to understand lens of the epic quest and thinking about characters we like and how we can use story and story structure to write a better story for our lives and to give us a sense of direction, a sense of meaning, and help us make real progress toward where we want to go. So that's what we're here to do today. Rocking the beanie again. I think it's the first time since episode 2. Another cold one here on the coast of Maine. As I mentioned before, I have to cut off the heat when I record, so I'll probably get gradually more kind of tense sounding and with some chattering teeth, very possible. But these are the things I do because I'm on an epic quest to make this show, and the show must go on. If you're not already following the show on Instagram at Me and the Quest, would love to have you over there. Working on some new things, going to kind of be shifting up my social media approach here in the next week or so. Actually, and by the time this comes out, I might already be trying some new things. Might even be over on TikTok soon. So if you are on TikTok, TikTok's funny. I didn't get it at first, but I feel like at some point in the last month or so, I've been on there trying to, kind of get my bearings. I'm about to launch an account on there focused on music education, production, songwriting stuff, which is, one of the main things I do, and trying to find online students and freelance clients and stuff like that on TikTok and just try to, help people make content that's fun to make and that people can get something out of. At some point, just kind of with getting on there and experimenting, and what at first was just sort of overwhelming and I didn't get it. I felt very old when I first got on there. Starting to really like it. So I definitely think that one, TikTok's not going anywhere. So I'm going to hop on there soon. So if you're on there too, feel free to follow me at Me and the Quest. As I said, this is part 2 of a little 3-part mini series talking about defining some of these key characteristics I see in the main characters and defining this for ourselves. So the idea of gifted superpowers, potentially fatal shortcomings, which is what we're going to talk about today. And then next week we'll talk about skills and developing skills. And so these are 3 things that most heroes kind of bring to the table. They're innate, gifted superpowers, these things that make them special and unique. Their shortcomings, which we're going to talk about today. And that sort of adds to the stakes, the drama of a movie, right? So if you don't have any sense that the hero might fail, that the hero might give into temptation, the hero might be blindsided by this weakness they don't have, that doesn't make a good story. And that's because that's not relatable, right? Because we all have even the people we most admire personally, or people that we can just sort of, public figures, they have, even the most heroic people have these shortcomings. And to some extent, maybe they've gotten really good at building a life that plays to their strengths and kind of minimizes the effects of those shortcomings, but we've all got them. So when you see a character that doesn't have any shortcomings and seems invincible, that's why we don't like that in a movie. It's why it's not interesting, because it's not relatable. It's not real life. So we're going to talk today about how to see our shortcomings and work to improve them, basically, where we can, and where we can't improve it much, just build a life that can sort of minimize the impact, the negative impact that's going to have on our life. And then next week, we'll talk about developing skills, and that's the scenes that happen in so many movies where the hero, like the training montage, and they're learning to do all these different things that they had some sort of unique gift that set them apart, but then they have to go through this transformation process of learning skills. And so that's what we're going to talk about next week. All right, last week superpowers, this week shortcomings, next week skills. Then we'll be getting close to wrapping up season 1. And as I teased, season 2, looking at bringing in some guests, kind of experimenting continually with just different formats, different things, hopefully trying to grow the show a little bit more. But if you're already here around the time this comes out and you're part of the small but faithful audience that's engaging and giving me feedback and all that, thank you so much. Glad you're here. Let's get into act 1 of the show. So in this first segment of the show, right, we talk about what's the problem that we're trying to solve, or work our way around or understand in this episode. And you would think, well, okay, this one's pretty obvious, right? Like this idea of a shortcoming, like this could be this thing that could be our undoing, that could keep us from sort of fulfilling our destiny, if you want to use some big, lofty language. And that's true. That is what I want to talk about. I want to talk about these shortcomings. But simply having a shortcoming is not actually what I see as the problem. I think what I want to make clear is that having a shortcoming does not mean something's wrong with you. It does not mean that you are more flawed than anyone else. This is something that we all bring, we all have, and it's just a matter of understanding what our shortcomings are. And that is the problem I want to talk about. Not that we have shortcomings, it's about being blind to what they are. It's a lack of self-awareness, of self-understanding. Think about the difference in your life or in people you know's life between when they know they have a shortcoming, or maybe a pattern they tend to repeat, or a trap they tend to fall into, a temptation they tend to give into. Think about the difference between knowing that, even if it doesn't mean it goes away, but just being aware of it and being completely unaware. The difference between not noticing you keep dating the same kinds of people that keeps ending in the same way, and then when you realize that's what's happening, and you might still have that tendency or that desire to be with that kind of person, but now at least you know and you can see and you can make a conscious decision. The difference between someone who's so caring for other people that they never set up any boundaries, never care for themselves until they just self-destruct and sort of burn out. And then the difference between someone who still very much has that tendency, has a big heart, has that desire to help as many people as possible, but at least now they can say, but at least now they can start to be aware that, they need to set boundaries, that they need to take care of themselves too. And that tendency doesn't go away, but at least now they're aware. For me in this episode, I have no problem being vulnerable, so I'll talk about a handful of my shortcomings probably. But one of them for me is self-absorption, which might come as a surprise to some people because I never get pegged, at least to my face. I've never been called like selfish, narcissistic, anything like that. To the contrary, I actually often get, comments about being the nice guy, being the sweetie, being the guy that, like other people are kind of like getting into drama or complaining or being mean-spirited. And it's kind of like, Ben, you're just everyone, you're just nice and everyone likes you and you're just nice to everyone. And like, that's kind of just the vibe I put out apparently. But when I talk about self-absorption, I really do mean that, where it's not, I don't always act selfishly, but in my own internal world, I can be extremely self-absorbed and just kind of only be thinking about myself, only be thinking about things that I find interesting and never kind of stopping to think about how another person in my life is doing, or how what I'm doing is affecting someone in my life. Like I can definitely just be extremely inward focused. And that tendency has not gone anywhere. But as I've learned that about myself, I can now introduce habits into my life where I stop and try to get the attention off myself as much as possible. Yeah, and I can try to normalize and sort of make routine stopping to, even oftentimes I have to write it down, like, hey, I should do this for this other person, or I should touch base with this person because I haven't in a while. And because it's just so easy for me to get into my self-absorption. And I still am too much. I really believe that. I am still too inward focused. But at least that awareness has helped with that shortcoming, right? So the problem is not having a shortcoming. That's human nature. That's just how it works. We all got it. We all got our own set of shortcomings to deal with. And so that's not a problem. The problem is our lack of awareness, our blind spots, our unwillingness to admit to ourselves what our weaknesses are. And so that's what I want to address today. Let's start with this idea of like a straight up character flaw, or just being a terrible person. Here's the thing. This podcast is not about making terrible people slightly less terrible. Okay. So honestly, if you're watching this, and especially if you're this far in, you're probably not a terrible person. But even if you are a terrible person, I hope you get something out of this episode and it makes you less terrible, but this show is not for you. This is meant to be for, good people who are trying to maximize their potential. This is about just identifying the things that are going to hold us back, or, maybe be our undoing, or be the one thing that is the difference and the reason we don't get to where we want to go. So we need to identify that. So I'm not talking about like real deep character flaws, just being a terrible person, being completely narcissistic, being greedy, being just ugly to people, and mean-spirited, and or so obsessed with climbing the ladder or becoming powerful or whatever that you'll just trample anyone. I'm not even going to address that. It's sort of its own thing, its own category. So much of this show is about the language of the hero. That's villain stuff. So we're not even really touching on that. Next is like a category of something that might be more like a disorder, an addiction, these big, heavy things that I am not trying to suggest I can fix with this episode. Just don't think that I'm trying to provide some sort of quick Band-Aid solution to anything like that. Deep anxiety, depression, addiction, anything like that. I honestly believe that this show and these ideas can help with that. I really do believe that, but I'm not an expert, and I'm not trying to suggest that all you need to do is like, oh, just do this one thing, you'll be fine. Like, suck it up. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. I wanted to make that crystal clear. And then one more category before we get to what I really want to talk about. One more category of just these big, universal temptations, sort of just the cliches, if you think about the undoing of a politician, or any sort of celebrity, when it all kind of crumbles around them, the allure. And this is also like most movies, the villain is after some combination of power, money, sex, glory, fame, like those traditional temptations. Again, like I think, and you might even be able to identify like, yeah, one of those is mine. Like that's what I am constantly tempted by. That's understandable, but those are pretty universal. And what I really want to get at today is more person specific. These things that don't look on the surface like it's a big flaw. Like it might even seem like a good thing, but you're obsessed with it. So it might actually be your undoing. We all, regardless of personality type, regardless of our goal, regardless of where we find ourselves, those big ones, those big traditional vices, traps that people fall into, we should all very much be aware of those. But that's not really where I want to spend the majority of the conversation. And I think maybe those some of those things should get their own episode at some point and talk about that, but that's not really where I want to camp out today. All right, so all of that to say, this is where I really wanted to arrive. Most shortcomings are shadow sides of our superpower. So that can sound a little bit abstract. I'm going to say it again. Most of our shortcomings are shadow sides of our superpower. I know that's a little abstract, so let me give you a couple examples from my life. Last week in the Superpower episode, I introduced this idea that one of the superpowers I see in myself is imagination. And I intentionally didn't use the word creativity because creativity has built into it the act of creation, the act of actually making something. And while I do make plenty of things, songs, this podcast, that's not nearly as innate and easy. It's honestly more than anything a skill I've developed. And it comes out of a deep, deep well of imagination that I can't turn off. And so it's like, well, I got to create something, even from just about as young as I can remember. That's kind of been how it's worked. It's like, well, I just have so many ideas. Like I just got to make something, but the making isn't, the making and the executing is not my innate skill set at all. So on the positive side, right, my imagination, it allows me to dream up things that don't exist. It allows me to see things that in a way that most people around me or in any environment don't necessarily see, and that's definitely a superpower, and it's something I'm proud of, and I'd try to play to that strength as much as possible. But big old but for you. Big old but is that it's definitely a shortcoming too. When my imagination is unchecked, it's a shortcoming. I can get lost in daydreams, idealizing the past, wondering what could have been, looking toward the future, imagining, this life that I'm going to have someday, and that's when I'm going to, be content or whatever. And for me, most of the time, it's idealizing the past and or idealizing the future, and totally missing the present. And that's where my life is happening, and I hate when I do that. I can also get so lost in daydreams of things I'm going to make that I never actually make anything. So the very thing that is a superpower is also a shortcoming. Little side note here too, if you listened to last week's episode, or if you ignored my advice at the beginning and you didn't listen to last week's episode and you're still listening, and maybe you're someone, especially if you have a more negative bias, if you can see if you're like well aware of some of your shortcomings, but not so much your strengths, you can kind of use this as a reverse engineering to figure out what maybe some of your strengths are. Like maybe some of the things that you see in yourself as an obvious shortcoming, maybe there's something there where that could actually point you to your superpower too. And it doesn't mean it's not a shortcoming, but maybe if you could start to see that as not just like a fatal flaw that's there for no reason that you want to get rid of, but maybe it's sort of a dormant superpower that you're not acknowledging. One more example for me, I've talked, I think, before about another one of my things that I have identified as a superpower is, I think the word is vulnerability. It's a little bit of a overused word, but I am comfortable. I'm comfortable with self-deprecating humor. I'm comfortable writing pretty like intimate lyrics and sharing them with the world. I'm comfortable talking to a camera and putting this on the internet and talking about my shortcomings, and like I'm not going to lose any sleep about this. Like I'll lose sleep about other elements of this project, but the whole the fact that I was self-revealing doesn't bother me. It also allows me to have some pretty deep friendships and deep relationships with people because I'm willing to sort of go first and be vulnerable. Downsides, I can hold it against people that are unwilling to go there, or I can hold it against people who just seem shallow and like they don't have anything going on beneath the surface, and like I'm deep, man, and you're just like shallow and I don't want to spend time with you. Like that's a shortcoming. I'm not saying I'm right. It can be a shortcoming when life is not deep and intense and I have to kind of swim in the shallow end. That can be frustrating, and unfortunately, that's okay that I'm frustrated by that, but like I also have to learn to that's life, and it's not always going to meet me with deep, vulnerable experiences. So just another example, trying to just paint some examples here. So those are some examples from my life, from the shadow sides of what I see as a superpower, and then that flip side of the same coin being maybe a shortcoming. So we talked about like big character flaws. Again, probably if you're listening to this, chances are you're probably not a terrible person. You're not the villain in the story. I strongly doubt that. And then acknowledging that there are some things that are just really deep, serious, important issues that I don't want to gloss over and say like, oh, just listen to this podcast, you'll be fine. I understand that. Then there's like the desire, the seduction of power or fame or whatever, those kind of classic seductive vices that might be our undoing. Yeah, like obviously, like don't have an affair, don't sell your soul for a pile of cash. Like, yeah, we get that. Those are obvious ones, and it doesn't mean that they're not important and that they can be super obvious and we still fall for them. I'm not saying we shouldn't care about those, kind of traditional temptations, but I think the real magic here is when we can get really specific about ourselves and start to identify these things that might not even be seen on the outside as a real negative thing, but left unchecked, if we let them kind of run rampant or overstep their bounds, these things that can actually be our undoing. And that's what we want to avoid, right? So let's jump into Act 3. A couple things I want to do here. I want to talk about a couple more practices, kind of like I did last week with your superpowers, a couple practices to help you really get clear about what your shortcomings are. And then I also want to talk about kind of how to build a life that plays to your strengths and helps minimize the shortcomings, right? So Act 3, here we go. So my list of sort of self-awareness exercises to figure out what your shortcomings are is basically identical to the one I did last week. So I would start personality tests, things like the Enneagram, which I just can't emphasize enough. That's how important that's been for me. And in the epilogue, the end of last week's episode, I talked about my favorite resources. If you're interested in diving into the Enneagram for the first time, you can check that out. So something like the Enneagram, but even things like Myers-Briggs, anything that can, like even basic extrovert, introvert, reading about that a little bit. It can, and oftentimes in one exercise, just spending a little time with any of those things, kind of in one fell swoop, you can learn about your strengths and your weaknesses. So that'd be a great place to start. And then conversations with friends, with trusted people. And talking about it, making it awkward last week when you asked them to call out what's good in you. Make it awkward times 2. Ask them to call out, what if there's anything that they see in you as a potential undoing. And again, it's a really scary thing. I understand, and that's going to be weird, and probably most people won't do that, understandably. But here's what I think will happen. I think most of the time you're going to get called. Most of the time, the response is not going to be like, yeah, you're just a total, I'll use the word jerk, since I still never really landed on how strong language I wanted to use on this show, but we'll just use the word jerk for now. But yeah, you're a real jerk. But yeah, like it's easy to imagine them just calling you out as a big jerk and it just kind of tearing you to shreds. Like, but I actually think most of the time what's going to happen is they're going to have a really positive take on it. Like, hey, you've got all this potential, but like, I see you doing this instead. And if they're a good friend, especially, I think that's what they're going to do. Is they're not going to, tear you a new one, but they might be able to point out some things that you haven't seen in yourself. So that's sort of the conversion rate on people actually taking me up on that. I can't imagine being super high, but if you are feeling a little brave and you want to ask a friend, to call that to your attention, you might learn a whole lot, or you might just confirm kind of what you're already starting to think about. And then finally, good old self-reflection, just thinking about, again, patterns. We've talked about this last week with the positive side of it, but just patterns, relationships that have gone bad, not just romantic relationships, but friendships, work relationships, things that, self-destructive patterns, things you've missed out on, things you wish you would have done differently. Again, it's probably not that hard to think about your shortcomings. It's probably somewhat obvious because we've all got a mess of mistakes and regrets and things we wish we could kind of have a redo on. And if you can just take a little bit of time to be honest with yourself, you'll probably start to see those shortcomings. And it's going to start to feel a little not super fun. This is why I wanted to put this episode after the superpower, like to balance that with the positive side that, this is something that you kind of tend toward, and it isn't, it's not bearing good fruit for you. It's kind of holding you back. You're causing some damage with it. But look, if you just flip that around and see that this is actually just the downside of something really positive you bring to the table, that awareness can help you, again, play to your strengths and minimize the negative effects of that shortcoming, the downside. And that's where I want to end the episode. I want to talk about, I think it was episode 5. I think it was the inciting incident episode. I can't remember what I titled it. Starting to get to the point where I've done this enough now where I'm starting to lose track. But I talked about this idea of the writer self and the character self. That's, in the language of the show, we're kind of these characters that are living out a story, but we also have a lot of agency to be the writer. And so what we want to do, once we've identified superpowers and once we've identified shortcomings, is as much as possible write a life where we are playing to those strengths and we are minimizing the negative effects of the shortcoming. Here's another example from my life. Going back to this idea of imagination versus creativity, how I can... I have this great imagination, but actually doing anything with it, and the tendency to get lost in daydreams and just sort of waste my life away. Here's what I've done with that. Here's what I've done to kind of fix that, to play to my strengths and minimize the negative. With this whole 1,000-day commitment that I'm on, where I'm committed to 1,000 days of just sort of not allowing myself to even stop and second guess it, just keep making things. That eventually led, the first couple of 150 days or so of experimenting led to this idea for me in the quest. It's been how I've been approaching music too, just make stuff. Make. That was weird. I created this show. I created some goals for my music, both the music I write and make, and also kind of building up more of a portfolio of working on other people's music. I have all these goals, and what it's done is it's allowing me to use my imagination. So something like this show, I'm getting to use my imagination and come up with all these fun episode ideas, things I'm really excited about. Lots of social media exclusive content, a lot of ideas for guests to have on and what I want to talk about, and things I want to make that I think can really help people and that I'm just really enjoying making and dreaming up. My imagination is on fire. It's going crazy. It's getting to do what it does. But because I've created a system and sort of these fill in the blanks where I have to do an episode every week, I got something clear I got to get done. I've got these goals I got to reach. Now the downside of my imagination, which is to get lost in the kind of floating around, not actually doing anything, daydreaming, navel gazing, all that stuff, is it's allowing that imagination to thrive. But the downside of not actually doing anything about it, by creating deadlines, by creating a clear system where I say, hey, just write an episode every week, make this many songs by this date, those kind of goals, it's keeping that negative side of my imagination at bay. So as you identify your superpowers and you identify your shortcomings, how can you craft your life to play more to your superpowers and let that side of the coin, that side of you, thrive and fully express itself, while also minimizing the negative effects of the shadow side, right? I think so much in life, trying to be a healthy person, comes down to this idea of balance. And so this is my big takeaway from these 2 episodes. Take the time to figure out what your superpowers are. Take time to become aware as much as you can of your shortcomings, and then write a life that plays to those strengths. And that's going to lead to fulfillment. That's going to lead to a good impact on the world. That's going to lead to a lot of fun, honestly. And then, at the same time, do what you can to minimize the negative impact of those shortcomings. Doesn't mean they go away. Doesn't mean you don't have any shortcomings. You never get to that point. So think about what you can do in your life, starting today, I hope, to start to play more to your strengths and start to minimize the impact that your shortcomings are having on your life, because it's holding you back. All right? There it is, episode 8. In the epilogue today, we're talking about my Enneagram type. I will reveal my Enneagram type if you haven't figured it out already, though I think if you are an Enneagram person and you've listened to these last 2 episodes, you're probably figuring it out. But I will officially talk about my Enneagram type. I'm going to kind of approach it in this kind of part 2, talking about the Enneagram. I'm going to talk about what I most identify with my type, and then the parts in a typical description that maybe don't actually ring all the way true with me, and some of the steps I've taken to become a healthier person because of the Enneagram. All right. As always, if you're on YouTube, the epilogue will pop up somewhere on the screen. And if you're listening to the podcast, sit back, relax. Here we go.